Well, good morning. Thanks so much for tuning in to another Cornerstone Bible Fellowship Sunday service online. We're so glad that you are spending this time with us, and we're really excited about today's message and even the next couple of weeks. We're going to be going through the book of Colossians. We're going to take 5 Sundays, we're going to go through that, and we're going to explore it and see what God has for us. It's really exciting. It's one of those key books that teach us about the real identity of Jesus Christ. But before we jump into that, let's do some worshiping and let's sing this song together.
Here we go. Glorious. Shout it out and glorious. Sing. Make it loud. Jesus, Jesus, we shout your name. Jesus, Jesus, we make your praise. Glorious. Come on. You are glorious. Come on, if you serve a glorious God, shout yeah. Let's sing it together. My God, you reign. My God, you reign. Forever and ever. Forever and ever. How great your name. It's your love, saying. Your love remains. Forever and ever. Forever and ever. You stay. You stay the same. Shout it out, shout it out. Shout it out, sing it out. Sing it out. For the Lord is good. Say, shout it out loud. You are glorious. Glorious, sing glorious. That's it. Shout it out and glorious. Make it loud. Make it loud. Jesus, Jesus, we shout your name. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, make your praise. You are glorious. Come on and clap. Hallelujah. God, you are glorious. Oh, my God. My God, you reign. Forever and ever. Forever and ever. You how great your name. It's your love. Come on. Your love. Forever and ever. Forever and ever. You stay. You stay the same. So shout it out, shout it out. If you know He's good, sing it out, for the Lord is good. Shout it out loud, you are glorious, glorious, sing. Shout it out, say glorious, make it loud. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, make your praise. You are glorious. Oh, you are glorious. Yes, you are. So we sing this. Shine, Jesus. Shine, Jesus. God, you shine for all the world to see. You are glorious. Shine, Jesus. Say, shine, Jesus. Lord, you shine for all the world to see. You are glorious. Let's sing that one more time. Shine, Jesus. Sing, shine, Jesus.
In the beginning was the Word.
And the Word was with God.
The Word was God.
He was with God in the beginning.
Through him, all things were made.
Without him, nothing was made that has been made.
In him was the life, and that life was the light of man.
A good person.
A man.
Someone who lived a long time ago.
He was in the world, and though the world was
Made through him, the world did not recognize him.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I have no idea.
He was a nice guy. A man in a book.
Doesn't matter.
He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him.
I thought a lot about it.
I go back and forth.
Was he the Son of God?
Yet to all who received him, to those who believed his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. He is the way,
The truth.
The life.
He's God.
My King.
My Savior.
Well, I'm so excited to jump into God's Word today. We're going to be looking into the book of Colossians. We're going to be doing it for 5 weeks, looking at the themes in Colossians and pulling out some practical things that we can apply and just get on with in our lives as we pursue Christ and seek to grow up in our Christian experience. But before we jump into that, I just want to make mention that, as you know, last week, Pastor Eversley shared, and I thank God for what he placed in his heart, but he also shared that he had worn the wrong colors by accident. He wore his blue, which is a St. George's Cup Match team color. Well, I just want you to know this is no accident. I'm wearing blue, blue, and more blue because I am blue and blue through and through. I am a St. George's fan, and so it's going to be an interesting year and no game, so I can hold on and put my head up high knowing that I will not lose anything this year. We'll figure out what happens next year. But in any case, back to Colossians. It's a great book, and we're going to spend some time. Normally when we go through the Bible, one of the ways in which I like to teach is to go verse by verse. And so Colossians is it's 4 chapters, I should say, and to go through that will take quite a while. But we're going to do an overview of Colossians, hence we'll be done in 5 weeks, Lord willing, okay? So I want you to commit to read the book of Colossians. Literally, there are 4 chapters. It will not take you that long. A half an hour will get you through all 4 chapters. You can listen to it. We've got lots of different ways of reading it and digesting it. So commit to do that over the next couple of weeks as we dive into Colossians, okay? So of all the Bible's teachings about Jesus Christ, none is more significant than the verses that we are going to look at today. And the reason is what is so important in the Christian experience is finding out, understanding, and identifying who Jesus Christ really is. We live in a world that has many different ideas about this Jesus. Maybe he was a good guy. He taught some pretty cool things. He did some pretty cool tricks or miracles. And we have lots of different ideas. But it's so important that you and I understand who this Jesus really is. There's one book that I really want to encourage you to read when it comes to the real identity of Jesus. It's written by Dr. Josh McDowell, and it's called More Than a Carpenter. Probably a familiar title for some of you, but it really just goes through and looks at the life of Jesus and comes to the conclusion that, you know what, he was much more than a carpenter. And he claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be God himself, and either he was right and truthful or he was a lunatic. Couldn't have it both ways. So read that book. But the point is, it's so important that we have the right perspective of who Jesus is, especially as we are building our lives upon Jesus. Now, the main theme in the book of Colossians is this: the sufficiency of Jesus Christ, or Jesus is enough. And this is another way that we could state that. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Now, this is a very important concept when we go through the book, and as we go through it, we'll try to pull out some historical and some cultural realities so that you can understand why Paul is so adamant as he's writing this letter as to who Jesus Christ is. Because one of the things that was going on in that culture, which is very similar to what goes on in our culture, is that a lot of people like Jesus. They like the concept of Jesus. They like calling on the name of Jesus. But it's Jesus plus my bank account. Or Jesus is important to me, but I also have to do this. Or Jesus is important to me, but I have to take care of this part on my own. And what Paul is writing this letter to address is that same idea, that no, it's Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. So we're going to read a couple of verses. We're going to be reading from Colossians chapter 1, 15 to 19. So let's read through that together so that we can look at all of those verses in context, and then we'll come back and make a few notes. So here we go. Verse 15, Paul writes, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him." And so that's what we're going to be looking at, those verses, as we consider this whole idea of Jesus Christ numero uno, Jesus Christ number one, Jesus Christ having the chief priority, that place of priority. Now, a couple things to remember or to learn or to understand about this book and why Paul wrote it. This book was written to a little church in Colossae. And Colossae is, well, it was what is what now is Turkey, okay, a part of Turkey there. It was a Roman province, and the population of Colossae at that time was predominantly Gentile, okay, so not Bible believing, no Christians or whatever. For the most part, they were Gentile. But there was also a large Jewish community there. And so what we find in the culture that Paul was writing into was that persons came away with some Gentile, pagan, worship, idolatry sort of theories and ideologies. But also from the Jewish perspective, the legalism and the ceremonialism was also very rich. And so when you put those two things together, this was what was colliding, and this is what was impacting on the church there. Because people who were getting saved, who were in the church, came from that culture, right? So you had that going on, and so you had these competing ideologies as to, what is Jesus all about? Why is it important? Is he really important? Do we need to add a whole lot of other things to this concept of Jesus? And so there was a lot of false teaching, a lot of heresy that was going on. For the Greeks in that culture, the Gentiles at that time, they had a large desire and an appetite for knowledge. And so they almost worshiped knowledge. So while they appreciated that Jesus was important, it's worth listening to, worth finding out what he was like, he's like, well, on top of that, you still needed to have all this deep knowledge, because without it, you'd be incomplete. And then from the Jewish perspective, you had, well, Jesus is important. Yep, that's fine. You can have Jesus, but you also still need to be circumcised. You still need to follow the law. You still need to worship on Saturday. You still have to do all of those things. And so Paul just had to break through all of that and say, listen, let me tell you who the real Jesus is that you are called to follow. And so Paul reveals Jesus Christ's true identity by viewing him in relation to four things. And we'll look at those four things. The first is God the Father. So viewing Jesus in relation to God the Father, in relation to the universe, in relation to the unseen world, and in relation to the church. Okay, so we're going to go through those 4 things, and God's going to help us, I really believe, to apply some of these lessons that Paul was teaching that church a long time ago, because in many respects we live in that same idolatry system of spiritualness and deep knowledge and what have you. And sometimes you and I, if we're not careful, we can say, well, Jesus is important, but I still need this other stuff as well. So this is where Paul starts off in verse 15. He says, the Son is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God. So a few things to know about the heretics or the false teachers that were trying to infiltrate the church is this. They denied Jesus' humanity. Now, they had this very pagan concept of idols and gods, and there were many gods, and you pick the gods that you want to help you. So you would have maybe a fertility god, you might have a farming god. Jesus is alongside that, and you had this other god for getting rain, and other god for this, other god. So Jesus was sort of like in this mix of all of these other gods, and so they didn't think of Jesus as really being human, and this is why, because the way that they considered the gods at that time and the multitude of the different gods was that there's a main god, however you want to decide how that works, and from the main god, all of these other gods sort of come out, and Jesus is one of those gods that come out. So he was a lesser god, worth listening to, some importance, but nonetheless, he was something that came out, an emanation, they would say, from God. The other thing that they taught was that spirit was good and material or flesh or matter was evil. Now, again, kind of hard to wrap your mind around that, but that's one of the things that they taught. So if Jesus came from God, right, it was crazy for them to understand or consider that Jesus could somehow take on a body, because a body was evil. So it's like if Jesus came from God, either they got mixed up in this whole Christian thing and he didn't really take on a body, but if he did take on a body, that means that he was like one of the lowest of these spirits that came from God, because there's no way that a spirit would take on a body that was evil and all the rest of it. So they had this thing going on. So they came to the conclusion that, you know what? Jesus can't be God. He might be worth listening to. He might have some good teaching stuff going on. He might even have done a couple of miracles, but he couldn't be God because that just doesn't make sense. So they would say, you know what? Jesus was not adequate for salvation. He might be adequate to fix this area of your life, but you still got to do this, you still got to do this, you still got to get that God, you still got to have this God in your back pocket, you still got to do all of those things. And that was sort of the way that they looked at it. And on the other side, talking about it from a Jewish perspective, as we said, for them it was, listen, Jesus, yep, he was Jewish, he came, Lion of tribe of Judah, all of that good stuff, but you still got to keep the Sabbath. You still got to do it this way. You still got to be circumcised. And Paul is talking into that. So he says, the Son is the image of the invisible God. The word image there means likeness, okay? It means likeness. And the Greek word is where we get our English word icon from. So one of the ways that we can really look at this is to consider an icon and everything that the icon represents. I think one of the well-known icons would be Apple, right? Everyone knows about Apple. Maybe you're an Android user. I'm not bashing Android, but I'm just using Apple as an example. When you see that little apple, right? It's got a little bite out of it at the bottom. You know, you see that apple and you don't instinctively think to yourself, wow, that's a cool sticker. Look at that sticker. I like the color, I like the shape. That's not what you think of. As soon as you see that, your mind, because it's been so saturated in Apple world, in this world that we live in, you're thinking technology, you're thinking Steve Jobs, you're thinking iPad, Apple Watch, iPhones, you're thinking all of those things, iMacs, you're thinking factory in China, you're thinking iCloud, you're thinking all of those things simply by looking at the icon. And that's the idea that Paul is bringing about here when he uses this word that says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In other words, everything that God is, Jesus represents. So when you see Jesus, you see everything that God is. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that although we're made in God's image as well, but we're not perfectly made in his image. God is holy, we are sinful. We are made in his image, but we aren't made morally in his image because we're different in that respect. Also, we're not created in his image essentially. And what that means is, like, we're made in God's image, but we can't do what God does. God is omniscient, meaning he knows everything. We don't know everything. God is omnipotent, which means he is all-powerful. We're not all-powerful. So although we're made in God's image, we are not made perfectly in his image. But unlike us, Jesus Christ is made perfect. So everything that God is found in Jesus. And that's why Jesus says here in John 14:9, one of the days he was having a conversation with his disciples, and Philip asked a question. And Jesus answered. He said, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" So Jesus makes it very clear. He's saying, listen, I can sort of pick Philip's brain a little bit. You know, I've been hanging out with Jesus, and this is really cool, and you're telling me more and more about God the Father. Well, show us God the Father. And Jesus is like, well, hang on. Like, you've been missing this all this time. Listen, if you see me, you see God. Because Jesus is the image, the icon. He represents everything that God is. And that's the point there. And Paul goes on, and he says, the firstborn over all creation. So Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and is also the firstborn over all creation. Now, a lot of religions and some persons that you might talk to, they might jump on this verse and say, see, that proves that Jesus isn't God because he was born first, and then all of the other stuff was created. In other words, he can't be God because God can't create himself, right? That is not the way in which this word is being used here. The idea and the word used for firstborn, it can mean the firstborn naturally, to come first. But in most instances, it refers primarily to position or rank. That's the way that the word is being used here, position or rank. And in both the Greek and the Jewish culture, the idea of firstborn was that it was the right of the son, of the firstborn son to the inheritance, the person or the son who had priority. If you remember the story of Esau and Jacob, you'll remember that Esau was actually born first. He was the older brother. But it was Jacob who was the son of promise, and he received the inheritance. He received his blessing from his father. So that is the way in which that word is being used in terms of firstborn, priority, the one who has the right to the inheritance, not necessarily the one who was naturally born first. So what Paul is saying here is that Jesus has first place. That's the point. He's firstborn over all creation. The second thing Paul does, he views Jesus Christ in relation to the universe, okay? And he says this, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth. Things in heaven and on earth. Now again, the false teachers viewed Jesus as the most important spiritual being that came from God, but they were convinced, since they said material stuff was evil, that he must have been like the lowest of the spirits if he actually created the earth. So they're trying to give some importance to Jesus, but not giving him the full weight and denying who he really is. But Paul emphatically declares that no, in him, in Jesus, all things have been created. One of the things I really thank God for is some of the experiences that I've had prior to pastoring. I didn't even know, but for the most part, before then, I was in environmental science. All right, I guess you're always in environmental science if that's what you did. But that was my passion. That was my profession. That's what I did. So I spent a lot of time scuba diving or bird watching or turtle tagging or just lots of pretty cool stuff. And to really appreciate that the things that I was able to study and see up close, Jesus literally created them. It's just mind-boggling. And I just remember so many intricate pieces of the world God created, and that's me appreciating that, wow, Jesus, you made this. You made this. I remember even our last series that Pastor Eversley just concluded, I Am God's Canvas, and he was showing us some beautiful scenic pictures and what have you, just to appreciate that, God made that. Jesus made it. Nothing that you see and get all excited about was made without Jesus. He did that. And then think about this. Think about your best scenic view. Like it could be made up of over 200 different components, right? Sea, water, bird, Jesus made all of those individual things. Jesus did that. And one tiny change in the way the earth rotates or the pull of gravity would have catastrophic results. Jesus created things just the way that they needed to be created, and he sustains it all. That's what Jesus did. So third, Paul goes on and he views Jesus in relation to the unseen world. So he's talking there about the created things in heaven and earth, the things that we see, right? But Jesus also created the unseen world. He says, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. And he's talking there the spirit world of angels and demons, the things that we know are real, but we don't actively see with our eyes. And the reality of it is that in some religions, depending on who you talk to, someone will say, well, Jesus is an angel. But Jesus is not an angel. He created the angels. He created the unseen world as well. He did those things. And the angels, in fact, worship him. So Paul is just making it absolutely clear. Jesus created the heavens and the earth. He also created the unseen stuff. Jesus is creator. Don't get caught into thinking, well, Jesus is just important, but he couldn't have been real and he's not really God because, no, Paul's saying this is who Jesus really is. And then Paul goes on to say, and all things have been created through him and for him. Everything. So that brings us to a very important question that you and I have to face. Why were you and I created? We're talking about the fact that Jesus created the heavens and the earth and now the unseen world, but what about you and I? Well, Paul makes it very clear that all things have been created through him and for him. You and I have been created for Jesus. We have been created to be in relationship with Jesus. And that's why until we come into right standing relationship with God through Jesus, our lives are very tentative, like we don't know what to do. There's an unsettled space in us, and we're trying new things, hoping for a different result, and trying to make peace when the only way that we can find that complete peace is with Jesus, because we were made for Jesus. We were made for that. And then Paul goes on and he says this, he is before all things. He is before all things. In other words, he existed before anything was created. Jesus is before all things. That's just who he is. This is his deity. He is God. And he says also that in him, all things hold together. Now, that's a pretty profound statement. All things hold together. But what's really, really profound about that is something that many physicists today still can't figure out. Now, you would know, I hope you know, if not, you'll learn something, but everything that we know, all the matter, all of the stuff that's around us is made out of atoms, okay? They're tiny, they're atoms. They're just these things, and you would have to look under it under an incredibly strong microscope to see the activity of these molecules and atoms and what have you. But what physicists have found is that in each atom, there's a nucleus, that's sort of the brain of the atom, and in the atom, in the nucleus, there are protons. Okay, there's some other stuff going on there as well, but protons, and the protons are positively charged protons, okay? So let's think about it in terms of a magnet. I got a couple of magnets here, and I'm sure you've done this at home or in school. It's kind of fun, but you know what happens when you put positive and positive together, okay? So if I go that way, it just keeps moving it. It's pushing, it's repelling. It's repelling. If I try to stick these together and let them go, they just pop out. What physicists are seeing, which is consistent in all of the matter around us, even the chair that you're sitting in, is that in the protons that are in the nucleus of these atoms, they are positively charged. So basically, in everything that we see, what we should expect is that it would literally just like blow away. That's what you would expect. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is, although the positive is repelling against the positive, somehow there is another force that is actually keeping it all together. Now, physicists, as smart as they are, haven't really come up with a good name for what that force is. So you know what? They came up with a real deep name, and it's this, the greater force. That's what they call it. They don't know what else to call it. Because everything about this does not make sense. What you would expect with everything that you and I see, the television even that you're looking at right now, is that it should explode. But it's not. And physicists do not know why, and they have called this thing, whatever's holding it together, the greater force. Now, is that proof that that's the hand of God holding it all together? I wouldn't say that. But it's definitely part of what God did as everything was created through Jesus in terms of his ability to sustain it all. He created it just the way that he wanted it to be, and he sustains it and keeps it all together. Paul says here, and in him, in Jesus, all things hold together. God is the one who can hold your life together. He's the one that holds the world together. And you and I, we need to trust him and know that this is really who he is. This is really who Jesus is. Jesus holds all things together, and he keeps our lives from unraveling. The fourth thing that Paul says is in relation to the church. Okay, in relation to the church. And in verse 18, he says this, and he, that's Jesus Christ, is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. So Jesus is the head of the body, the church. The church is a connected organism, but it's connected to Jesus, and Jesus is the head of it. Now, I know in our space and time, we like to use a lot of titles when it comes to the church. Maybe a pastor, bishop, elder, and lots of other words as well. And they're fine, they're relative. But the reality of it is that Jesus Christ is the head of the church. So if you find yourself going to a gathering of persons where, we're talking about, or they talk about themselves being the church or what have you, but there's no mention of Jesus or Jesus doesn't feature, that's not the church. You can't have church without Jesus because Jesus is the head of the church. No Jesus, no church. That's just the way that it is. He is the source or the beginning of the church. And Jesus holds the chief position or highest rank. And then again, firstborn, he says he is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. The idea of firstborn, we went through that already. It's that he has the chief position. He is positionally first. Of all those who have been raised from the dead or ever will be, Christ is the highest in rank. That's just what that means. That's who he is, okay? And then Paul goes on and he says this, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. In everything he might have the supremacy. We're going to come back to that phrase because God's going to help us, I believe, to really pull that out and apply some specific things. But let's go on to verse 19. Verse 19 says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Now, one of those false teachings that was going on in Colossae at the time that Paul wrote this. And the Gnostics, they were huge at that time. They were just really presenting these false doctrines and heresy as to who Jesus was and what life was all about, etc. And the Gnostics believed that divine power and attributes were divided amongst the various spirit beings. And so as a result, Jesus, we'll give him some clout, we'll give him some power, we'll give him some importance. But Jesus, he just got a little bit of the power that came from the divine big God, as did the God of rain, as did the God of fertility, as did the God of you name it. They had all of these different gods. And so they would teach that, you know what? Jesus got some of it just like all the other gods got some of it. And so this is why Paul has to specifically break through that, and he says, no, God the Father was pleased with the reality that everything that God is dwelt in Jesus. In other words, and you got to really put your mind back in Colossae a couple of thousand years ago, because this is what the teaching was. This is what persons would have learned in the culture. This is what, unfortunately, they would have brought into the church while they were learning new doctrine and purifying their mind. And this was what the impact of that cultural pressure was still having. They were saying, listen, Jesus is a God among other gods. But Paul's saying no, and don't think that Jesus got a little drip of power here and this God got a little drip of power. He says no. For God the Father, everything that God is, he was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him. In other words, who Jesus is everything that God is. Everything that God is in Jesus, because Jesus is God. And God was pleased that this was the way that it was. So Paul is refuting this. He's refuting this. All right? Now, I want us to just take a breath for a second. A lot of this for some has been new, trying to wrap our heads around a different culture and how it relates to where we are and some of the heresies and the false teaching that was going on there. But I want us to be able to move what we're learning from our minds to our hearts so that it shows up in our lives. And so one of the questions one could have is like, well, how does this impact on me? Okay, I get that, this is how people thought way back then, and I get that this is how some people behaved way back then, but like, I'm here, I'm in this sophisticated era now, I got Google, I got all the resources that I need. Well, I want to warn you, the world that we live in today is as spiritually charged as the world that Paul wrote into 2,000 years ago. The whole idea of whether or not Jesus is God, that question still comes up today. The whole question as to whether or not Jesus is enough, or do I just tuck Jesus in my back pocket, but I can also have Buddha in this pocket, and then I can also read Confucian in this pocket. It's the same world that we live in today. And the message of Paul then is the same message that we need today. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Jesus is sufficient. Jesus is enough. So I don't want you to think that this was like an archaic thinking that person said way back then and somehow we're so sophisticated now. No, the whole spiritual elements today and crystals and tarot reading and you name it, it goes on and on and on. The world that we live in is as spiritually charged as it was back then. And we need the same instruction today as Paul gives it, even though he gave it 2,000 years ago. Much of the heresy or false teaching that Paul confronts is still around today. So it is important that we understand who Jesus really is. That way, we will be able to identify the false teachings and perceptions, because they're all around us. They're all around us. Don't be deceived. Now let's go back to verse 18. Verse 18, that last part of that verse says this, so that in everything he, that's Jesus Christ, might have the supremacy. Might have the supremacy. Another way that we could state that phrase would be like this. So that in everything he might have the first place. That he might have the first place. Now, if I were to ask you, is Jesus important to you? It would be a resounding yes, right? It would probably be so loud I could hear it coming through the camera right back here. Because if he wasn't, you wouldn't be sitting here listening to me talk about Jesus. Right? There's too much Netflix to be watched, or there's other things that you could be doing, right? If you are normally a churchgoer, obviously during this COVID time, we're doing things a lot differently, but if you were normally going to church, if I asked you that question, you would say yes, and that would prove it. Jesus is important to you because you rearrange some parts of your lives to sort of give him some space. But the question that I want us to consider today is not whether or not Jesus is important, it's whether or not Jesus has first place. It's a completely different question, completely different answer. Not whether or not Jesus is important, it's whether or not he has first place. And this is why Paul in this book, and we'll get into some more of the other teachings later on as we go through this series, but also as Paul teaches elsewhere in the Bible, Jesus is God, whether you like it or not. That's just the way that it is. So the question that has to be asked is, do we accept that he is who he says he is? Because when you and I sort of ruffle around this or be like, well, Jesus might be pretty good or he's kind of important, that doesn't mean that Jesus is up there saying, oh no, I'm not who I say that I am, because Jesus is God. Jesus is God. And what he wants us to do is recognize that he's God and put him in the first place in our lives. So that's the question. Does Jesus have first place? And that's the question I want you to ask yourself. Don't ask, is Jesus important? Does he have the first place? First place shows up in our obedience. If the Bible says that this is what Jesus would want us to do, are we quick to obey it? That would be an evidence that yes, Jesus has first place in my life. You know, what he wants should be the first consideration in anything we do. So if I have a choice to make, if I could go this direction, or maybe right in the middle, it's not a question of convenience, or at least it shouldn't be. It's not a question of, well, this is what I prefer. It's a question of, God, what do you want? Jesus, what do you want? Because what you want is what I want to do, because I want to give you first place. Think about this as an example. Let's say that you have a very good childhood friend, went through primary school, high school, college together, always stayed in touch. Now, on this side of things, family, life gets busy, careers and all the rest, still very friendly, still in a very good space, but just not finding the time to spend together like you used to. You know, life gets busy. And both of you come to the conclusion that, you know what, we have got to get together. We have got to catch up. We've got to catch up. And you say, yes, we're going to do it. Let's plan it out. Let's get the babysitter sorted so that we can have that time to get together. It's scheduled. This is going to be a priority, and nothing's going to break this dinner date, right? And so the day comes up, and all the plans are in place, and you go over to your friend's house, and you know that this is like a priority. This is going to be a banging time. We're going to catch up. We're going to eat some food. It's going to be great. And you get there, and you're invited in, and there's laughter, there's catching up and all the rest of it. But, you know, you're looking forward to the fellowship, but you're also looking forward to the food. And you just don't smell any food, right? You're in there for a little while, and they've offered you water and drinks or what have you, but it's just like, well, okay, maybe there's a barbecue at the back or something, but I'm not smelling any food, right? And then the time gets closer and closer to actually eating, and the host starts to prepare the meal. And in so doing, she opens up the fridge, or he opens up the fridge, takes out food, which is saran wrapped, takes the saran wrap off, starts to carve out some food, put it on the plates, heat it up in the microwave, put it on the table. Hey, it's time to eat. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that, well, it looks like they're giving us leftovers. I thought that we were a priority in this. I thought that this was going to be like this thing which sort of everything else made room for, but it just doesn't. Like, I can see the turkey that she just finished cutting from had some missing, so like this is leftovers. No, before I go any further, I have nothing against leftovers, so please don't hear that. I'm just trying to make a point. Leftovers are great. But sometimes we can treat Jesus the same way. We want to say in terms of, well, Jesus, you're my priority. You will have the first place. You will be able to get it done right first. You get it all and all the rest of it. But when it's time for that to happen, Jesus gets leftovers. Now, it's not for me to decide, like, you know, how much leftovers you're giving, and because everyone's going to be different. But this is the question that we have to ask ourselves. Am I giving Jesus leftovers, or is he really first in my life? There are three main areas where this should show up in our lives, and it often does. If we're honest, let's look at these together. In our time, in our talents, and our treasure. Your time, your talents, your treasure. And again, we're talking about whether or not Jesus gets the best, or whether or not he's getting some leftovers. Now, whether or not we decide to give Jesus leftovers in no way diminishes who Jesus is. Jesus, again, isn't waiting for us to give to him for him to decide that he's really God. No, that would be foolish. Jesus is God. But as we continue to give him leftovers, we're saying, whether we like it or not, that Jesus, you are important to me, but I'm not ready to give you first place. So what does that look like with our time? You know, the question is, does God get the first and best of your time and my time? No, the time that we have is all we got. You know, when some days there are different projects to do and this, that, and the other, and you wish you had more time, but you don't. Everyone has the same amount of time. But what are we doing with that time, right? I think about it even in terms of like getting up in the morning, okay? And what's the first thing that we think about? You know, are we grabbing our gadgets to check on the coronavirus news? Nothing wrong with that. But if that's first, that speaks volumes as to where we're placing our importance. Or are we intending to get into our quiet time for the day, but we're using our phone or our tablet for our Bible reading, but all the notifications are popping up in the background, and then an hour later we find that we haven't even started our quiet time yet because we were caught up doing Facebook and it took me here, there, and everywhere. How are we using our time? Like, even as parents, right, we want our children to be successful. We want to teach them how to ride a bike. I'm thankful I was able to teach my youngest child just recently to ride a bike, so he's off and going. Or, again, for me, teaching them to throw a fastball. So I got a baseball family. My boys play, my daughter used to, but we spend a lot of time playing baseball, and those things are cool. But how much time am I or you investing in teaching our children about God and about how to grow and about life lessons and how to be successful, not just with money, but with God? How are we using our time? Are we determining that our time is a gift from God so that we use it for His glory, His kingdom, seeking His face, doing His will? Or are we doing things on our own and saying, well, God, I got some time for you, but hang on, I got to do this, and this. But I got 5 minutes for you. Yes, you're important to me, God, but I got your 5 minutes, so hopefully that'll be good for you. Leftovers. It's an important question that we have to ask ourselves. Your talents, another place in which this shows up. You know, when you think about the gifts and the talents and the things that you have that enable you to work, to be in a career, to be successful, the only reason that you and I have any capacity at all is because God first gave it to us. And so the question is, well, how are we using our talents? Right? How are we using our talents? Are we using our talents selfishly to get attention for ourselves and doing what we want, doing what's convenient for us? Or are we using them to pursue God, to pursue what He's called us to do, which is tell others about Jesus? Like, how do we see our office that we go into? Like, how do we see that walk through Hamilton or a town on a given day, maybe that we have to go to the bank? Do we see it as an opportunity to just mingle with people, to encourage somebody, to show that, you know, I'm a child of God? How are we using the gifts and the abilities that God's given us? Maybe you're a sports person and God has blessed you with the physique and the wherewithal to play basketball or football or whatever it is. Is it just, well, look at all the attention that I get. Look at the satisfaction that I get from playing this. Or is it, well, God, you gave me this. I'm so glad you did. I get enjoyment of it, but what I really get enjoyment of is using it for your glory, thinking about you, thanking you for it, and using that as the opportunities come for me to tell other people about you. Our talents, the things that we have, right? And the third thing is your treasure, your treasure. I think one helpful way to think about our treasure or our money is in two categories: first and best and good enough. First and best or good enough. Now, this isn't a sermon about money and we need your money and all the rest of it. That's not it at all. Money, in these conversations sometimes, we get so hung up on it. But listen very carefully. Jesus isn't after your money or my money. He's after so much more. We think that by our money, that somehow distinguishes how close we are to Jesus or what have you. Now, it might be an indication of where our hearts are. Jesus says that. But Jesus is after so much more than our money. He's after so much. He wants all of us. And that's why Jesus says that, you know, where you put your treasure, that's where your heart's going to be. So yes, it is an indication of where our heart is. But it's not because, like, you know, churches need to be big and fancy and ritzy, or we need to draw. No, it's not. Jesus doesn't need your money or my money, but He knows that where we put our money is where we allow our hearts to follow. Jesus wants everything. It's not about money. So the question has to be, well, Jesus, do I give you the leftovers of the treasure that you give to me? And I know the first question that may come up is, well, I don't have much, especially in this environment right now with coronavirus and my job security and all the rest. And I am in no way trying to be insensitive, because this is a personal question that you have to answer for yourself between you and God. But the reality of it is that each and every one of us know whether or not we're giving God our best, or whether or not he's just getting the, here it is, the good enough. And that's not for me to decide. But these three things are areas in which we can evaluate oftentimes whether or not God is first in our place or getting leftovers. And we ought not give in leftovers. So the question again is simply this: does Jesus have first place? Does he have first place? Does he occupy the place, and all of your desires and my desires work around it? Or do we determine that this is what we're doing today, Jesus? You can come along with me. It's not the way that it should be. Jesus needs to have first place. So my encouragement to you today is this: a challenging message for me, right? And I'm trusting that God's been challenging you as well. This is something that we have to constantly be thinking about. This can't just be a conversation that we have once with God in prayer and say, well, phew, I had the conversation, so I guess no, it's every day. It's like, Jesus, am I putting you first today in this? Am I putting you first in this relationship with my wife? Because this is what I want to say, this is what I feel, but am I putting you first in that? Am I putting you first in terms of my relationship with my neighbor or my kids or my job? Or are you getting the best, or am I giving you leftovers? Let's pray. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much, God, that you are a patient God. And God, that doesn't mean that we should try to exhaust your patience, not that we could, and just sort of do our own thing and hope it works with you, God. No, but Father, nonetheless, I am so grateful for your patience, God. And I pray, God, that you would help us, God, to really cling to the truth of your word, which is Jesus is number one. He is numero uno anyway. He is God. Jesus, you are God. But whether or not we understand that and acknowledge it and let that move from our minds to our hearts, whether or not we let Jesus have first place in our lives, God, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so, Father, I pray that you would help us to trust you, God. Help us to pursue you. Help us to believe what you say in your word. Help us to trust you, Jesus, and know that you are not lying to us. You are God. You are trustworthy. We can follow you. And I pray, God, that we won't be naive, God, even though we live in this sophisticated world today with so much technology. I pray that we won't be naive to think that, this whole spiritualness and people questioning who Jesus is, or that was something for the days past. No, God, that's how the world is even today. So help us to cling to the truth of who you are, Jesus, so that we can see those false teachings and those heresies, God, and say, no, I'm following Jesus. He is God. He is my truth. He is my rock. So, Father, I pray for your grace, God. I pray for your help. And I pray as we look at these three parts of our lives, God, that you would help us to be truthful, Father, whether or not we're giving you leftovers in our time, God, and our talents and our treasures, God, or whether or not we are giving you our best. Help us, God. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, I trust that message was an inspiration and an encouragement to you that Jesus Christ deserves and wants to be priority in your life and my life. He deserves the first place. So let's determine to let him have that place, because when he does, we benefit and we grow as his followers. Tune in next week as we continue in the book of Colossians. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.